came down from heaven. One younger than the other, and they just came down just to look around. One look around the countryside. So these two angels set foot walking through the country, and they walked all day, and it started to get dark. They looked up there on the hill, and there was this big, beautiful farmhouse. I mean, it was something to behold. It was like a mansion, and the barns were all painted, and the sheds were all painted, and the fences were immaculate. They were horse-high, bull-strong, and hog-tight, as a good fence would be. And they knocked on the door, and they asked the couple there. They said, "It's getting late. We just wonder if you had a place we could sleep." Well, they hem-hawed around. They said, "Well, we don't want you sleeping in our guest house. Don't want you in our house." They said, "Well, won't you can sleep in the root cellar. You can sleep on the floor. It's out there by the barn." So these two angels did that. Well, in the middle of the night, the younger angel woke up, and the older angel was repairing a hole in the wall. And the younger angel asked him, "Why are you doing that?" He said, "These people have been so rude. They have everything. They made us sleep out here on this cold dirt floor, and you're out here helping them repair a hole in the wall." And the older angel said, "Well, things aren't always as they seem." So the next morning they got up, they took off, and they're down the road again. Same thing happens. It gets late. But this time they see a farmhouse that's pretty well run down. Paint chipped off of it. There's some boards missing. The shingles are gone. The fence is disarray. But they asked the couple there, said, "Can we spend the night? It's getting late." The couple said, "Sure, come on in." So the old couple, they shared what little food that they had with the angels, and they said, "Well, why don't you guys sleep on our feather bed in our room so you can get a good night's rest?" So the angels did, and in the morning, the angels woke up, and they could hear crying coming from the kitchen. And they went in there, and the old couple was bawling. They just sobbing. They couldn't believe, they were just torn completely up. And the younger angel said, Why are you crying?" And they said, "Well, we just happened to look out in the pasture this morning, and there was our milk cow, and she was laying there in the pasture dead. She was our only source of income as we sold her milk." Well, the angels took off and started to go down the road again. And finally, the younger angel stopped, and he said, "I'm so troubled." He said, "I cannot believe that you would repair the wall for that rude couple, the ones that had everything, but the older couple who depended on that milk cow, you let that milk cow die." Well, the older angel said, "Well, you see, I got up that first morning or that night, and I saw that hole in the wall, and I looked in that hole, and there was some gold and lots of money." He said, "So I repaired that hole in the wall so well that they'll never be able to find it." And he said, "And as for the milk cow," he said, "last night the death angel came for the old woman, but I gave him the cow instead." And he said, "Things aren't always as they seem." And isn't that true in life? Things aren't always as they seem to be. This morning I'm going to take us back to an old story coming back from the book of Genesis. It's about Rachel, Leah, Jacob. And I know you've heard that story countless times. I've heard it 100 times, and I get it. But unless you walk out of here this morning, you're going to be able to say this afternoon, "I heard that story 101 times." So I'd like to begin with the story. When most people read about this story, they generally start out in Genesis chapter 29. But if one does that, they actually miss the very first part of the story. It starts actually in Genesis 27, verse 43, and it says, "Now then, my son, do what I say. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran." This is Rebekah talking, telling him what to do. We're going to talk a little bit more about this verse a little bit later. In Genesis chapter 28, verse 1 through 3, it says, "So Isaac called for Jacob, and he blessed him. 'Do not marry a Canaanite woman. Go at once to Padan Aram, to the house of your mother's father, Bethuel. Take a wife for yourself there from among the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of peoples.' So Jacob does as he's instructed to do. He sets off for Padan Aram. In Genesis 29, 2 through 3, it says, "There he saw a well in the open country with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it, because the folks were watering from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all of the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. They would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well." So the shepherds, plural, roll this big heavy stone away from the well. Skipping down to verse 10, it says, "When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well, and he watered his uncle's sheep." Now we see that Jacob himself rolls that stone away. Apparently Jacob was very strong, not bad for a man of his age. So how old do you think Jacob is at this point in time? Any guesses? 30? 40? Jacob is 77 years old. How do we know that? Well, I'm glad you asked. In Genesis chapter 47, we see Jacob was 130 years old when he meets Pharaoh. Joseph is 39 years old. I'm no mathematician here, but I think I've got this figured out. If Joseph was 39 when Jacob was 130, then Joseph was born when Jacob was 91. 130 minus 39 is 91. Since Joseph was born 14 years after he arrived, Jacob has to be 77 years old. 91 minus 14 is 77. Jacob lived to be 147 years old. So being a man at this age, it's like being, in our day and age, it's like him being 40. So he is able to roll this stone away. I think he's probably showing his strength to Rachel. What kind of man he is, because he's already got eyes for her. Now in the beginning of chapter 29, we see that Jacob has met Rachel, and Laban has invited him to his home. Now, starting in Genesis 29, verses 14 and 8, it says, "Then Laban said to him, 'You are my flesh and blood.' After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, 'Just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be.' Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful." So we see that Laban has these 2 daughters, Leah the oldest, Rachel the younger. Rachel's beautiful, gorgeous figure. It's implied that Leah didn't have much of a figure. And she wasn't anything to look at either. Rachel in Hebrew means ewe, like the sheep, precious little sheep. Leah in Hebrew means cow. If my mother was here, she would jokingly say, she can't help it because she's ugly, but she could stay home. She's not a thing to look at. She's not a beauty queen by any sense of the imagination. She's older. Nobody's married her yet. But we will soon see when God is not at the center of one's life, it can quickly become a mess. Jacob names his wages by saying he will work for Laban for 7 years. In Genesis 29, 19 and 20, Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel. But they seemed like only a few days because of his love for her. We see in verse 19, Laban's answer is actually non-committal. You see, Laban is a devious man, full of deceit. Jacob has a vague promise with no clear agreement so as not to tie his hands. A lawyer would tear this agreement completely apart. However, I think it is that Jacob is not thinking rationally as his head is in the clouds over this beautiful woman, Rachel. Nevertheless, Jacob accepts this offer. Then Jacob said to Laban in Genesis 29:21, and Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, my time is completed, and I want to make love to her." Here I'm thinking, Jacob, instead of saying, "Bring me my wife," he doesn't say that, does he? He didn't say, "Bring me my wife, Rachel." He just says, "Bring me my wife." Left the door wide open for old deceitful Laban. In Genesis 29:22 through 25, so Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. And Laban gave his servant Zillah, or whatever it is, to his daughter as her attendant. When morning came, there was Leah. What? So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you 7 years for Rachel. Why have you deceived me?" So we see here that things aren't always as they seem. He's expecting to wake up in the morning with his beautiful wife. He wakes up with Leah. As Gomer Pyle would probably say back in the day, surprise, surprise, surprise. I can't believe that Jacob didn't realize who he was sleeping with. He's been eyeballing this gal for 7 years. His head is in the clouds. You must be confused, huh? Why did you not recognize that it was Leah that night? Was it because he brought her to you in the evening when it was dark? Maybe it was darker in the tent. Maybe it was dark and Leah had a veil over her face and he couldn't recognize her. Or maybe it was because your now father-in-law Laban the man full of deceit, threw a feast for you the night before. Some scriptures say wedding feast, others just say feast. Some scriptures just say he just invited the men for a feast. Feast in the Hebrew word is mista, which literally means drinking party. It's my belief, and it doesn't say this, but it's my belief that Jacob was probably a little bit tipsy. Plus, if you add in all the other things, he was not thinking clearly. Well, later in verse 25, Jacob says, "Why have you deceived me? You see, Laban is a cheat. He's full of deceit. Laban's nothing more than a crook." If we jump to chapter 31:7, which we won't read, but we'll see that Laban has cheated Jacob 10 different times on his wages. So we know what kind of a man Laban is. Remember when Jacob's mother, Rebekah, told him to flee her brother, and I said, I'll do more of this later? I wonder if it ever crossed Jacob's mind, or did he have flashbacks of any kind, that in Genesis 27:43, when his mother, Rebekah, tells him to go to Laban's house because he himself has been deceitful, as he cheated his brother Esau out of his blessing. Jacob was mad at Laban, but he was guilty of the same crime himself, wasn't he? I guess he just couldn't see past the plank in his own eye. In Genesis 29:26-28, it says, Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week. Then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work." And Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave his daughter Rachel to be his wife. To further back my thoughts about Jacob being a little bit tipsy, I don't see a feast for Rachel. He gives Leah to Jacob after the feast because Laban's trying to get rid of the daughter. But he doesn't throw a feast for Rachel. There was no need. There was no need. In Genesis 29-32, Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. And he worked for Laban another 7 years. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son, so she named him Reuben. For she said, "It's because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." So in the next few verses, we're going to see Leah start spitting out all these kids. She is a baby-making machine. She thinks, if I just have some sons, Jacob's going to love me. That'll turn the tide. He'll see what I am. He'll appreciate these kids, especially the sons. Jacob's now 84 years old. Needs some help around the house, doesn't he? But it doesn't make any difference to Jacob. He still doesn't love Leah. But we see that nothing is impossible with God, who makes promises and blesses people regardless of their age, because we see that when Jacob's dad, Isaac, was born, his dad, Abraham, was 100 years old. So being 84 wasn't that big a deal, was it? After having 3 sons, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, Leah thought this would make Jacob love her, but it wasn't the case. As each day passes, she lives with the weight of rejection. Leah was the one who bore the husband her children, but was jealous of her husband's love. Rachel was the one who had her husband's love, but she didn't have any children. Jacob saw that Rachel wasn't getting pregnant, so Jacob slept with Leah. It wasn't personal. It wasn't a personal thing. It was business. Got to have sons, got to have kids. The more sons and kids you have, the more livestock you can have. The more work you can get done. The bigger your family grows, you can feel like you can amount to something. Well, we see that Leah conceives again and gives birth to her 4th son, Judah. Hebrew for praise. But this time is different. She decides she can stay bitter or she can get better. She stops living for the love of Jacob and she starts living for the love of God. Leah's been dealt a bad hand in life. She's unattractive and unwanted. Things she has no control over. However, through these challenges, she seems to grow. Even the difficulties of her life, God is now present. You see, God is attracted to the unattractive because he didn't see things as man sees. Look at Jesus when he was here on earth. Who was he with? The lame, the blind, the leopard, the prostitutes. Jesus doesn't see as we see. Now in Genesis chapter 30, we see that Rachel gives her maidservant Bilhah to Jacob, and she has 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Leah then gives her maidservant to Zilpah to Jacob, and she has 2 sons, Gad and Asher. In Genesis 30, it says, during the wheat harvest, Reuben went out in the fields and found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Rachel says to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. You see, she saw Reuben with these mandrakes, which he got from the wheat harvest field. I doubt that Reuben knew exactly what a mandrake plant was or what it was for. Reuben was young. I can imagine he saw those pretty blue flowers, kind of purplish on that mandrake plant, and they had these little apple-like fruit on them, smaller than our apples. And he saw those, and he probably took them to his mother, happy and proud that he could give his mother his mandrake plants. But you see, Rachel, she knows what that mandrake plant means. Back then, they thought it was a magical plant for fertility. She wanted those mandrakes so she could become fertile, so she could have kids. Well, they make an exchange. Leah gives her mandrakes to Rachel. Leah then conceives a child. Mandrakes don't do anything for Rachel. See, you can't put your hope and trust in things in this world. You can't put your hope and trust in things like a magical plant of fertility. Leah has 6 sons in 7 years. Think about that, ladies. 6 sons in 7 years. In Genesis 30:22, it says, "Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her, and he enabled her to conceive." What a glorious day for Rachel. She gave birth to a son named Joseph. I think we know a few stories about Joseph, don't we? It's not until chapter 35 that Rachel has another son named Benjamin. Benjamin should have been a glorious occasion for Rachel as well, but it didn't turn out that way. You see, on the road to Bethlehem, Rachel started to give birth. The birth was difficult. The birth got so bad that Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin. And we see at the end of the story that Rachel is buried on the side of the road where she was giving birth. And later we see that Leah was buried in a tomb beside Isaac, beside Rebekah, beside Abraham, by Sarah, and eventually Jacob joined her in that tomb. I think this story can tell us a few things. I think it can tell us that honesty is the best policy. I think that it can tell us that God's purpose is not determined by human performance. I think it tells us that someone overlooked by people are chosen by God. When you feel unloved or forgotten, you got to remember that God sees you. The world may overlook you, but God never does. You see, things aren't always as they seem. If you've heard or need the prayers of this congregation, we'd like to help you. If you'd like to be baptized and put Christ on as your Savior today, we're going to sing a song, and we're going to ask that you come up front and let us know that. Thank you.